Welcome back, old friends, and a special greeting to new visitors of my channel. Fred and George Weasley are characters without whom the Harry Potter universe would feel incomplete. Their irreverent humour, bold pranks, and unbreakable optimism brought levity even to the darkest corners of the story. But behind their cheerful facade lie traits that some readers and viewers found far less charming. Today, we'll take a look at the less obvious sides of the beloved twins and discuss why Fred and George may not be as perfect as they seem. Enjoy the video. Number 1. They're terrible brothers. Despite the strong bond of family, Fred and George weren't always kind to their younger siblings. Their treatment of Ron in particular was often cruel under the guise of humour. They're the ones responsible for his deep-rooted fear of spiders, all because of a so-called harmless prank. Instead of inspiring Ron or helping him feel like a worthy member of the Weasley family, they frequently mocked his insecurities. They even gave the Marauders map to Harry instead of Ron, and rarely offered support or encouragement. Ginny, too, often went without the attention or care one might expect from older brothers, at least from what we see in the books and films. Number 2. They lack empathy. Laughter is wonderful, but Fred and George often failed to understand when it wasn't welcome. Their jokes, while entertaining to some, frequently disregarded the feelings of those on the receiving end. They rarely paused to ask, how did that make the other person feel? Whether it was classmates, younger students, or even friends, their jokes often crossed the line. For them, the thrill of a prank often outweighed any consideration for kindness or empathy. Number 3. Their products are unethical. When Fred and George opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, they turned mischief into profit. But not all their merchandise was harmless fun, and in fact, some of it raises serious ethical concerns. Take love potions, for instance. These dangerous brews can be misused for manipulation, and Harry himself nearly fell victim to one. Romilda Vane attempted to dose him with a potion, and if she'd succeeded, the consequences could have been severe. While love potions are a problem across the wizarding world, the twins' choice to sell them so freely put some of the blame on their shoulders. Number 4. They have dark tendencies. There's something unsettling about how much Fred and George enjoy making others uncomfortable. Many of their pranks seem aimed not just at humour, but at watching someone squirm. When Hermione criticised their behaviour, they dismissed her, saying she just didn't have a sense of humour. But the truth is, there's a difference between funny and mean-spirited, and too often their jokes were rooted in the discomfort or humiliation of others. Number 5. They lacked discipline. Yes, they're charming, yes, they're talented, but let's be honest, their behaviour at Hogwarts was dangerously undisciplined. They broke rules constantly, disregarded authority, and essentially did whatever they pleased. And somehow the school let them get away with it. The faculty seemed unwilling or unable to instill discipline, perhaps because of the twins' popularity or Quidditch skills. Ironically, the only person who ever seriously tried to rein them in was Dolores Umbridge, not exactly the hero of the series. Number 6. They're not that funny. Humour is subjective. While many readers and viewers adored Fred and George's antics, others found them tiresome, repetitive, or even annoying. Their comic relief was welcome early in the series, but as the tone darkened, their antics began to feel out of place. In a story about war, death, and sacrifice, their refusal to grow up made them feel oddly immature, as if they were stuck in a never-ending joke while the rest of the world moved on. Number 7. They can be cruel. Let's not sugarcoat it. Some of their jokes were downright mean. They openly mocked Slytherin students just for being in that house. They once booed a young first-year simply because he wore green. And that's not harmless fun. That's bullying disguised as humour. And unfortunately, Fred and George crossed that line more than once. Their status as funny guys doesn't excuse the times they made others feel small. Number 8. Their exit from Hogwarts was questionable. Their escape was legendary. Fred and George soared out of Hogwarts on broomsticks, leaving behind a corridor filled with fireworks, a swamp in the hallway, and a stunned Dolores Umbridge. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred whispered, grinning. Students cheered, the castle roared, but beneath the laughter was a different story, one that didn't end with applause. The Ministry was watching the Weasleys. Arthur worked there. Percy had already broken ties. Molly worried night and day. The twins' stunt didn't just defy Umbridge, it painted a target on their entire family. It was bold, yes, brave even, but also impulsive. They didn't stop to think what it might cost their parents, or how their public rebellion could ripple into consequences for people who didn't choose it. Dumbledore was gone, Hogwarts was under siege. Their exit felt like the grand finale of a performance. But war had just begun. And while the swamp was funny, the message they sent was clear. "We're out. Good luck to the rest of you." It wasn't just a prank, it was a decision to walk away. And not everyone had that choice. Number 9, they used students for experiments. Fred and George built their empire inside the walls of Hogwarts, and their classmates were the test subjects. They handed out candies that made people faint, vomit, or bleed from the nose. "Try this, it's only a prototype," Fred would say with a grin, as if a bloody nose was just part of the fun. The worst part? It usually was fun, until someone collapsed in the corridor or couldn't stop puking for hours. Their skiving snack boxes became legendary, but behind the laughs were real symptoms, real reactions, no supervision, no safety checks, just trial and error on human beings. Even Professor Flitwick expressed concern once when a second year turned purple from a sweet labelled experimental. The twins brushed it off. Side effect, George shrugged. Consent didn't make it safe. Just because a student agreed to test something didn't mean they understood the risk. These weren't minor pranks anymore. They were chemical experiments in magical form, distributed in a school full of minors. Fred and George weren't just pranksters, they were reckless inventors using their friends as lab rats. Number 10, they dismissed the value of education. Fred and George treated school like a joke. They skipped homework, mocked professors, and rarely took their classes seriously. Professor Snape loathed them, not just for their pranks, but for their constant interruptions. Even Professor McGonagall, who had a soft spot for them, once snapped, "If you spent half as much time on your studies as you do inventing things, you'd be top of the class." But they never listened. They didn't need grades. Or so they thought. They walked out of Hogwarts before taking their final exams. It was dramatic, unforgettable, fireworks in the hall, a flying broom exit. But walking away meant they also left behind any grounding in magical ethics, safety procedures, or advanced spell work. Their inventions worked, yes, but many of them were volatile. Skiving snack boxes made students collapse. Shield hats deflected curses. These weren't harmless toys, they were powerful tools, made by wizards who had never passed an egret. Their success blinded them to what they were missing. Knowledge, structure. The understanding that magic isn't just creativity, it's responsibility. They created products that could rival oral gear, but they didn't stop to ask if they should. What they lacked wasn't talent, it was discipline. And in the world of magic, that's not just a flaw, it's a risk. Number 11, they ignored family responsibilities. The Weasleys never had much. Hand-me-down robes, patched-up books, second-hand wands. But that was normal for Ron and his siblings. Molly and Arthur did everything they could to keep the family going. Bill sent money from Egypt. Charlie helped from Romania. Even Percy, with all his pride, worked his way up in the ministry. But when Fred and George struck gold with their joke shop, their first instinct wasn't to lift the family, it was to expand the brand. They did give their parents a lovely Christmas once. Molly cried when she saw the cozy gifts and the extra food. But after that, their success stayed mostly theirs. They poured their earnings into storefronts, self-writing quills, and edible darkness powder. "We've got big plans," Fred told Lee Jordan once, eyes sparkling, and those plans didn't seem to include easing the burden at the burrow. Ginny still wore old robes, Arthur still patched up the roof with spells. Their family's struggle didn't magically end when the twins started earning galleons. No one expected them to give it all away. But in a house where every knut mattered, their fortune could have meant security, comfort, even dignity. Instead, it became inventory. Joke wands, fake spells, trick sweets. Their dream came true, but they never fully invited their family into it. Not the way the Weasleys had always made room for them. Number 12. Careless use of magical items. Fred and George were brilliant with magical inventions, but brilliance without caution is dangerous. The Marauder's map was no ordinary artifact. It revealed every room, every secret passage, every person at Hogwarts, and yet they handed it over to Harry Potter when he was just 13. "We've decided you could use it more than we can," George said with a grin, "but a map that shows every person on school grounds, including teachers and students, wasn't something to treat like a toy. They never considered what might happen if it fell into the wrong hands. Harry used it to sneak into Hogsmeade, to spy, to roam the castle without detection. It helped him more than once, yes, but it also nearly got him killed. The map revealed Peter Pettigrew's name long before anyone realized he was still alive. If Snape had taken it seriously, if the wrong person had seen it, the entire story might have ended very differently. Fred and George meant well, but their casual decision put a powerful magical tool into the hands of a boy who barely understood its weight. Their recklessness didn't stop there. From canary creams to puking pastilles, their inventions blurred the line between joke and threat. They once slipped a Tung-Tung toffee to Dudley Dursley without telling anyone what it did. Dudley's tongue swelled to 4 feet long. Arthur Weasley had to fix it himself, and he was furious. "You could have been expelled, or worse," he scolded them. But Fred and George just laughed. They never asked, what if this had gone wrong? They never thought about what it meant to be responsible for magic. They were creators, innovators, but also in many ways they were careless. Magic isn't just mischief, it's power, and power in the hands of someone who doesn't stop to think is always a danger. Fred and George pushed limits, broke rules, and handed over enchanted objects like party favors. They never meant harm, but meaning well has never been enough to keep people safe. Number 13, disregard for the seriousness of war. Fred and George knew how to make people laugh. That was their gift. But during the rise of Voldemort, their light-heartedness started to feel out of place. While others joined the Order of the Phoenix and prepared for war, the twins poured their energy into their joke shop. "We've got a business to run," George said in Half-Blood Prince, brushing off concerns. They were building dreams while the world was cracking open, and for a time they didn't seem to notice. Their shop on Diagon Alley was a roaring success. Customers lined up for skiving snack boxes and decoy detonators, while outside, families disappeared and Death Eaters marched freely. Even Harry, who loved them, seemed confused. "You don't think this is all a bit strange, with everything going on?" he asked once. But Fred and George had found something that made them feel safe. Distraction. They laughed louder when things got darker. Of course, humor is a shield. They used it to protect themselves and others from fear. But war doesn't care for jokes, and their refusal to fully face the horror around them left cracks. When Dumbledore died, there was no clever trick, no joke left to soften it. That summer, their bright storefront stood like a memory from a different world, a world that no longer existed. By the time they joined the final fight, it was almost too late. Fred's smile, the one that had lit up every room, would be the last memory his family had of him. There were no more pranks, just silence and grief, and the echo of a war they had once tried, to laugh away. Number 14. Lack of respect for authority. Fred and George Weasley never cared much for authority. Their rebellious spirit made them fan favourites, but their defiance often came at a price. When Professor McGonagall warned them to be cautious during their 6th year, they laughed it off. "You two," she said sharply, "behave yourselves. The situation in the wizarding world is no joke." But for Fred and George, warnings from adults were background noise. They always knew better, or thought they did. At home, they rarely listened to their mother. Molly Weasley, exhausted and worried, would beg them to stop testing dangerous joke products on their siblings. "You could kill someone with those sweets," she shouted when they tried their nosebleed nougats on Ron. Instead of apologizing, they grinned. To them, it was all part of the fun, even if it meant ignoring their own family's concern. When people who loved them tried to draw a line, Fred and George stepped over it without hesitation. Even Albus Dumbledore, the one man nearly everyone respected, wasn't safe from their disregard. During Umbridge's tyranny, Dumbledore gave subtle guidance: remain calm, avoid escalation. But Fred and George wanted fireworks, and they got them, literally. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred whispered, as they abandoned Hogwarts mid-year. Their exit was legendary, yes, but also dangerous. They didn't stop to think what might happen to students left behind, or how Umbridge might retaliate in their absence. There's bravery in defiance, but there's also recklessness. Fred and George never learned the difference. They refused to be controlled, even when that control could have saved them. Their stubbornness turned every warning into a challenge, every rule into a joke, and sometimes behind their laughter there was real risk, not just for themselves but for everyone who followed them. Number 15. Using magic for personal gain. Fred and George Weasley never cared much for rules. From the moment they arrived at Hogwarts, they radiated a rebellious charm that both delighted and frustrated those around them. They were not content to merely pass through school quietly. They sought to leave a mark, bold, unforgettable, and mischievously magical. As students, they were admired for their brilliance, their daring, and their boundless creativity. But behind the laughter they inspired and the inventions they created, there was a darker thread woven through their tale, a willingness to use magic for personal gain, even when that gain came at the expense of integrity. One cannot deny that Fred and George were geniuses in their own right. They invented products that not even professional adult wizards had thought to create. Their line of magical pranks and contraptions, sold through Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, was a phenomenal success, yet many of their early prototypes and ideas were tested not in a responsible environment, but in the school halls, classrooms, and even on unsuspecting students. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, their portable swamp spell is celebrated by students for its audacity. But it also serves as an example of how they used Hogwarts not just as a testing ground, but as a launch pad for their ambitions, ignoring any potential consequences for others. Their commercial success was built in part on catering to the whims of young witches and wizards who wanted shortcuts. Take, for example, their invention of the skiving snack box. A brilliant product in its conception, it allowed students to fake illness and skip classes with ease. Each snack contained 2 halves, one that induced symptoms like nosebleeds or vomiting, and another that instantly cured them. While the twins insisted this was all in good fun, it wasn't merely about humor. It was profitable. Students desperate to escape classes bought them in droves. In Order of the Phoenix, even Hermione, usually the moral compass of the trio, admitted grudging respect for their ingenuity, though not without concern. Their target audience was, above all, the vulnerable and the reckless. Students who feared academic failure, who wanted to avoid punishments, or who were simply curious about bending the rules without consequences. Fred and George gave them tools to do so for a price. Their products normalized deception and fostered a sense that magic could and should be used to dodge responsibility. They weren't simply creating jokes, they were encouraging a mindset. and they profited handsomely from it. One cannot forget their line of spell-checking quills. At first glance, they seemed useful, even beneficial, an aid to help struggling students with their written work. But the quills weren't foolproof. In Half-Blood Prince, it is mentioned that Ron Weasley, their own brother, used one during his fifth-year exams. The result was catastrophic. The quill began to malfunction halfway through, leading to spelling mistakes rather than correcting them. While it may have been a faulty batch, the broader issue remained. Fred and George were willing to sell magical items that could interfere with formal examinations. They knew students would buy them to improve their chances dishonestly. They marketed academic fraud and cloaked it in the guise of mischief. This brings us to the decoy detonators and Peruvian instant darkness powder, used by students not for innocent pranks but to distract teachers or escape from situations of accountability. While these products would later serve heroic purposes during the resistance against Death Eaters, their original context was far more dubious. Students used them to dodge detention, sneak out of school bounds, or escape being caught after breaking school rules. The line between playful mischief and enabling rule-breaking was blurred beyond recognition. The Weasley twins often justified their actions by claiming they were undermining authority, especially when that authority was cruel or unjust, such as Dolores Umbridge's reign at Hogwarts. In many ways they were heroes of that period, symbols of rebellion and hope. But not all authority at Hogwarts was unjust. Many rules existed for student safety and discipline. By selling tools to bypass them, Fred and George were not just challenging tyranny, they were profiting from chaos. And in that chaos, other students paid the price. One telling moment came when they offered first-year students samples of their joke products without warning them of the side effects. In Order of the Phoenix, one such trial left a young student vomiting uncontrollably until the twins administered the antidote. This wasn't merely a prank, it was unethical testing. They used their classmates as guinea pigs, often without consent, simply to refine their products for market release. It was business at its most raw and ruthless, though masked in charm and laughter. Their business instincts were astonishing and their success undeniable. But it's important to recognize that some of that success came at the cost of encouraging shortcuts. In a world where magic is power, teaching young people to use that power to avoid consequences is a dangerous lesson. Fred and George became role models not just of creativity, but of cunning self-interest. They didn't teach responsibility, they taught resourcefulness without restraint. Their Time Turner escape kits, allegedly a joke as no actual Time Turner was included, fed into the fantasy of undoing one's mistakes. They capitalized on the desperate wish to erase failure, to skip the consequences of poor choices. These kits were wildly popular, not because they were effective, but because they offered an illusion. Fred and George were selling more than magical items. They were selling the dream of escaping reality. Even their fake wands, some of which turned into rubber chickens or burst into confetti, had unintended consequences. In the wrong hands or at the wrong time, they disrupted classes, caused injuries, or embarrassed students. Not everyone appreciated the joke. While Professor Flitwick occasionally chuckled at their antics, others, like Professor McGonagall, were less amused. She saw the potential harm, and she wasn't wrong. The line between humor and harm is razor thin when magic is involved. Number 16, negative influence on younger students. Fred and George Weasley, the beloved twin jesters of Hogwarts, were more than just a pair of pranksters. Their legacy ran deeper than portable swamps and fireworks in the Great Hall. They weren't just making students laugh, and they were shaping how younger minds perceived authority, discipline, and the very idea of learning. For years, the younger students watched them with awe, idolizing their defiance and turning their jokes into gospel. And that, more than any dung bomb or canary cream, may have left a lasting mark on the school's culture, one far less amusing than it first appeared. Colin Creevey, the eager Gryffindor who once followed Harry Potter like a shadow, found himself laughing along with the twins when they turned Professor Flitwick's classroom into a forest of floating hats. At the time, it seemed harmless. "Those two," Colin had giggled, echoing the same admiration that so many others shared. But what he, and others like him, failed to understand was that this act, seemingly light-hearted, quietly unravelled the fabric of respect that once clothed Hogwarts' academic halls. Fred and George didn't just reject the rules, they mocked them in full view of the student body. When Dolores Umbridge took over as headmistress and enforced a reign of terror, many cheered as the twins revolted. But beneath the satisfaction of rebellion, there was another message, a dangerous one, that all authority, no matter how it came to be, was worth mocking. Even when Minerva McGonagall herself tried to restore order, the echo of Fred and George's laughter lingered in the corridors, leaving students uncertain of which rules, if any, were meant to be followed. Take Dennis Creevey, Colin's younger brother, who entered Hogwarts in Fred and George's final year. He worshipped them from afar, pocketing skiving snack boxes and sneakily using Peruvian instant darkness powder just to experience their world. He once tried to transfigure a staircase into a slide and ended up sending a third-year Hufflepuff to the hospital wing with a broken wrist. The hospital staff scolded him, but Dennis was defiant. "Fred and George would have loved it," he said proudly. In that moment, the damage was done. It wasn't just the pranks, it was the values beneath them. Fred and George had a natural charm, and their irreverence felt like freedom. But not all students had the judgment to wield rebellion wisely. To the impressionable minds of first and second years, mischief became a measure of intelligence. Respect became a weakness. The more they laughed at Peeves and bent the rules, the more they believed they were following in the footsteps of heroes. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Fred and George's grand exit was spectacular. Fireworks flew, hallways filled with smoke, and students cheered. Even the teachers couldn't help but smirk. "I suggest you take extra care, Mr. Filch," Professor McGonagall had said with a thin smile. But that applause masked the ripple effect that would follow. After the twins left, a wave of chaos swept through the younger years. Copycats emerged, accidents increased, and Hogwarts, already under siege from within, now faced internal sabotage in the name of twin legends. A Ravenclaw second year named Hugo Wimple tried to release a flock of enchanted ravens in the library for fun. They tore through the restricted section, destroying rare volumes. When questioned, Hugo admitted he'd found instructions for the charm scribbled in a margin of a Weasley's Wizard Wheezes brochure. What had started as an admiration for cleverness turned into contempt for responsibility. Ernie Macmillan, once a prefect known for his stern adherence to rules, found it harder to maintain order in Hufflepuff House. "They don't listen," he confided to Susan Bones one evening. "They think school's just a waiting room before a joke shop. They think every authority figure is an obstacle, not a guide." His frustration echoed a deeper problem. The cultural shift that occurred when humor became the currency of popularity and discipline became a joke. Even in Gryffindor, once home to the twins, the balance began to tilt. Lee Jordan, their loyal friend and announcer, tried to rein in the younger students who worshipped the twins' memory, but he failed. His protests were drowned out by laughter and mimicry. He found a first year trying to jinx the armor suits in the entrance hall just to see what would happen. When caught, the boy declared, "I'm just testing like Fred and George did. That's how you learn, isn't it?" But Hogwarts wasn't meant to be a lab for dangerous experimentation, and learning was never supposed to be reckless. In their quest to entertain and challenge authority, Fred and George left behind more than gags. They left a template for irreverence, one that didn't include their genius or foresight. The students who followed lacked their talent. What they had instead was a diluted sense of purpose and an inflated sense of defiance. One particular event, often ignored in the broader narrative, involved a fifth year named Lionel Dubbins. Inspired by tales of Fred and George's prank with the Tum-Tum toffee, Lionel attempted to create his own variant. It backfired. A Slytherin girl ended up in the hospital wing with a dangerously swollen throat, unable to breathe. Madame Pomfrey worked for hours to stabilize her. When questioned, Lionel shrugged. It was meant to be funny. They did worse. He didn't understand where the line was. He hadn't been taught where it was. In the Goblet of Fire, Fred and George had crossed age lines to try and enter the Tri-Wizard tournament, a stunt that left them sprawled on the floor with white beards and bruised egos. Laughter followed, but few noticed Dumbledore's stern silence. "You're not old enough," he had warned. Yet that warning became part of the joke. Students remembered the spectacle, not the message. And so the idea that rules were barriers to be broken, not lessons to be learned, continued to spread. Number 17, refusal to admit mistakes. Fred and George Weasley were born to entertain. Their presence in the Harry Potter series has always brought a spark of mischief, humour, and bold defiance. Their charm, however, often masked a deeper issue, an unwillingness to confront their own mistakes. Time and again, the twins would brush off the consequences of their actions with a joke or a laugh, refusing to seriously acknowledge the damage they had done. This refusal to own up, though masked as comedic bravado, carried with it implications for their maturity and emotional growth, affecting not only themselves, but those around them. One of the earliest signs of this pattern can be found in their treatment of Ron's pet rat, Scabbers. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Fred and George delighted in teasing Ron about his pathetic excuse for a pet. They even attempted to transfigure Scabbers into something more amusing. "He might have gone back to the kitchens," said Fred. "He probably knew we were planning to strip him of his tail." At the time, their jests seemed harmless, typical sibling banter. But in retrospect, the twins were endangering a living creature, even if unknowingly. Scabbers was, of course, no ordinary rat, but Peter Pettigrew in animagus form. Their reckless play could have triggered unimaginable consequences, yet the twins never acknowledged their mistake. It became just another joke in their repertoire. Their disregard for consequences was even more apparent during their early experimentation with joke products. In the Order of the Phoenix, Fred and George test skiving snack boxes on first-year students, offering them sweets that induce nosebleeds or vomiting. The ethics of such an action were dubious at best, especially considering the age and vulnerability of their test subjects. Lee Jordan, their loyal accomplice, seemed equally entertained, but the twins' inability to reflect on the potential harm was striking. Professor McGonagall's disapproval was met with shrugs. Their defense was always the same. They were working on something brilliant. The question of consent, of potential medical harm, never entered their equation. It was all in the name of innovation, and any backlash was treated as stuffy resistance to fun. Even more troubling was their tendency to encourage rebellion without fully understanding or accepting the consequences. In their fifth year, Hogwarts was under the tyrannical rule of Dolores Umbridge. Fred and George became figureheads of resistance, setting off fireworks, planting portable swamps, and launching prank attacks. Their courage in standing up to oppression is undeniably admirable. But the chaos they created often placed other students in danger, and their dramatic exit from Hogwarts, though iconic, was more about spectacle than strategy. They left behind a school still entrenched in fear, offering no roadmap for those who remained. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," George called out as they soared away. Brave, yes, but also irresponsible. They did not stay to fight. They left others to deal with the consequences of their rebellion. Another instance of deflected responsibility came in Goblet of Fire, when the twins attempted to fool the age line protecting the goblet. Eager to participate in the Tri-Wizard tournament, they brewed an aging potion and stepped over the line, only to be thrown back with long white beards. The scene was humorous, but it also reflected a deeper pattern. Rather than respecting the rules or accepting their age limitations, they attempted to cheat. And when their plan failed, they laughed it off. "I suppose we're not allowed to ask for a beard trimmer in our Christmas stocking," Fred joked. At no point did they question whether their desire for glory had clouded their judgment. It was easier to joke than to reflect. Their treatment of Percy also revealed their tendency to mock instead of understand. Percy, the older brother who embraced rules and order, became a frequent target. In Chamber of Secrets, Fred and George invented songs about his pompous prefect status and filled his room with loud explosions. To them, Percy was a laughable figure, a caricature of authority. They never considered the psychological strain he was under, or the fact that he was trying, however awkwardly, to establish an identity separate from the chaos of the Weasley household. When Percy eventually distanced himself from the family, siding with the ministry, the twins saw it as betrayal. Yet part of the blame lay in their own unwillingness to treat his ambitions with respect. In Half-Blood Prince, the twins' business, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, became a phenomenal success. They marketed love potions, you-know-poo, and decoy detonators with flair and brilliance, but again, their success was built on the same disregard for ethical boundaries. Their love potions, in particular, bordered on the dangerous. The possibility of coercion, of misuse, was never seriously addressed. When Ron accidentally consumed a strong dose of Romilda Vane's potion, the situation turned comedic, but it could have easily turned tragic. Slughorn had to administer an antidote. And yet the twins never reconsidered selling such potent and manipulable products. They remained convinced that if something was funny, it was harmless. The lack of reflection extended to their family as well. Molly Weasley often worried about her son's future. She didn't understand their obsession with pranks, nor did she approve of their dropping out of school, but Fred and George rarely treated her concerns with seriousness. They rolled their eyes at her discipline, dismissing her as overbearing. They never sat down to consider her fears, the possibility that they might be throwing away real opportunities, or that their recklessness could bring harm. Even when they opened their shop, Molly's approval was lukewarm at best. Yet they pushed forward without acknowledging the emotional weight their decisions placed on her. Their dynamic with Harry also showcased their occasional insensitivity. While generally loyal to him, they often treated his problems lightly. In Order of the Phoenix, when Harry was overwhelmed with visions and emotional instability, Fred and George were among those who laughed off his concerns, chalking up his behavior to stress. While others, like Hermione and Ginny, took his warnings seriously, the twins maintained a posture of amused detachment. Their default mode was always deflection. If they acknowledged fear or confusion, it had to be in the form of a joke. Number 18, endangering other students. Fred and George Weasley were beloved by many for their relentless pursuit of mischief and laughter within the hallowed halls of Hogwarts. But in the rush to idolize their sense of humor and entrepreneurial spirit, few paused to reflect on a sobering reality. Their disregard for safety often teetered on the edge of negligence. Their antics were not merely playful pranks confined to the Gryffindor common room. They exploded into the corridors, the Great Hall, and classrooms, spaces meant for learning and growth, leaving behind chaos and, at times, real danger. One of the most memorable examples of their reckless behavior occurred during their final year at Hogwarts. In Order of the Phoenix, the twins staged their grand exit by unleashing a torrent of magical fireworks in the school corridors. The fireworks were more than just loud and colourful distractions. They were enchanted with aggressive behaviour. Catherine wheels burned holes through portraits, dragons chased terrified students, and firecrackers exploded with enough force to shatter glass. The chaos was such that the book describes, but the fireworks continued to burn and bang all by themselves. Ut P. Chapter 28. The display may have been spectacular, but it was launched with no warning, no preparation, and no consideration for the students who might have suffered burns, trauma, or been caught in a stampede of frightened children. This wasn't an isolated incident. Fred and George repeatedly tested their inventions not in private or controlled conditions, but on fellow students, often younger and more impressionable. Their line of skiving snack boxes, for example, were marketed directly to Hogwarts students as a way to avoid classes. They included nosebleed, nougat, fever fudge, and puking pastille, all designed to induce temporary illness. These were not subtle effects. The twins bragged that one side of the product would make the user bleed, vomit, or faint, while the other would provide a cure. As humorous as this may sound, it introduced serious health risks. They encouraged children to trick their bodies into violent reactions without any knowledge of how these spells or ingredients might interact with existing conditions. What if a student had allergies, or took a second dose by mistake? Even the testing phase of these products was a concern. In Order of the Phoenix, they used first-year students to try out their experimental candies. "We tested them on Montague. He's still not quite right," George had joked. Oot P. Chapter 29. Montague, a Slytherin prefect, was actually shoved into a vanishing cabinet by the twins, another prank with dark consequences. Though it was meant to silence his interference as he tried to report them, the cabinet malfunctioned, trapping Montague in a liminal space between worlds. He was later found disoriented, ill, and unable to speak coherently. What began as a comedic maneuver ended in psychological trauma. The twins never apologized, and no one held them accountable. Throughout their time at Hogwarts, Fred and George often treated the school as a testing ground for their joke products, but more disturbingly, they treated their classmates as guinea pigs. Their dangerous candies were left in common areas to tempt younger students. Their fireworks were triggered during exam week, a time when focus and calm were crucial. They released a portable swamp in the middle of a corridor, which, while lauded by some as a clever protest against Umbridge, blocked access routes and created hazards for both staff and students. Filch, who was tasked with cleaning the mess, was unable to remove it, indicating the strength and unpredictability of the magic used. Notably, absent from their decisions was any consideration for consequences. The duo often operated under the motto that it was better to ask forgiveness than permission, if they asked at all. They operated behind teachers' backs and undermined school rules with a brazenness that went beyond rebellion. Their disregard wasn't aimed solely at authority figures like Umbridge, it was indiscriminate. Any student within proximity to one of their experiments was a potential casualty. During a Quidditch match, they enchanted bludgers as a joke, a decision that nearly injured a Ravenclaw player who was struck in the leg and hospitalized for 2 days. Their fame and charm allowed them to avoid serious repercussions. Teachers like Professor McGonagall, though often exasperated, were reluctant to punish them harshly, perhaps believing their mischief was ultimately harmless, but their peers sometimes paid the price. In one incident described by Lee Jordan, a group of second years had to be escorted to the hospital wing after trying toffee terrors, which caused their teeth to grow uncontrollably and bleed. The twins considered this a successful product test, laughing as Madame Pomfrey administered shrinking solutions and cleaning charms. Their sense of invincibility grew with each stunt. Even when caught, they seemed incapable of genuine remorse. When Hermione confronted them about their testing practices, warning that they were being irresponsible with younger students, they waved off her concerns. To them, Hogwarts was a sandbox for trial and error, and their peers were simply part of the experiment. Fred once said, well, if they're dumb enough to try it, they deserve what they get. It was a chilling comment, one that revealed a cavalier attitude toward consent and consequences. This disregard was particularly evident during their interactions with the younger Gryffindors. Dennis Creevey, a first year, once accidentally triggered a decoy detonator while inspecting one of the twins' prank parcels. The device exploded in his hand, knocking him backwards and giving him a nosebleed that lasted several hours. Fred and George dismissed it as just a hiccup, offering Dennis a prototype nosebleed nougat in what could be described as equal parts humor and cover-up. No apology followed. Dennis didn't dare report them. The culture that surrounded Fred and George began to normalize this behavior. Their actions were praised as legendary, epic, and brilliant by their classmates, which created an environment where dangerous behavior was dismissed as school spirit. Even after they left, students continued to mimic their behavior, often without understanding the underlying magic. One Hufflepuff boy attempted to create his own version of the skiving snack box, but misfired the incantation, resulting in a week-long fever that nearly turned fatal. The twins' influence extended beyond their presence, shaping Hogwarts into a playground of magical recklessness. Not all students viewed the twins as heroes. Cho Chang reportedly expressed concern after the swamp incident, noting that a group of Ravenclaw girls had been trapped in a corridor for over an hour, unable to get past the enchanted barrier. One girl sprained her ankle, attempting to leap over the sludge. Another fell into it and developed a rash due to unknown magical residues. Fred and George never addressed this collateral damage. Their stunt had made the front page of the Quibbler, but no one reached out to those affected. Their enterprise, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, would later become a commercial success, but its roots were steeped in unsafe practices and casual experimentation. They were not licensed potion makers, nor did they adhere to any kind of health regulation. When Harry gave them his Triwizard winnings to start the business, he trusted that they would use the funds wisely. Instead, they doubled down on their methods, using Nocturne Alley ingredients and acquiring unregulated magical artifacts. The shop was known to sell items without proper labeling or age restrictions, drawing quiet concern from a few members of the Order. The situation with Montague remains the most damning. After being trapped in the Vanishing Cabinet, Montague's parents demanded an inquiry. However, due to the tense political climate and the Ministry's focus on suppressing Dumbledore's supporters, the incident was quietly ignored. But Montague was never the same. He struggled with memory lapses, intense headaches, and paranoia. His grades plummeted, and he was eventually removed from the Slytherin Quidditch team. What was a joke to Fred and George became a turning point in a student's mental health. Despite all this, the twins continued to enjoy a golden reputation. Their charm, humor, and underdog status as Weasleys allowed them to be seen as lovable rogues rather than reckless inventors. But the truth remains, their tenure at Hogwarts was littered with incidents that could have ended in tragedy. In many ways, they were lucky. No student died, no one suffered permanent disfigurement. But it wasn't because the risk wasn't there, but it was because they happened to operate in a space that often forgave charm over caution. Had the events of the books unfolded in a slightly different way, had a firework struck a young Seamus Finnegan in the eye, had Dennis Creevey suffered brain damage from a prank gone wrong, had Montague vanished permanently, the narrative would be much darker. But those outcomes were not impossible. They were narrowly avoided. The twins walked a dangerous line, one that too often blurred the boundary between mischief and malice. Fred's death in the Battle of Hogwarts cast a long shadow over his legacy, and many chose to remember only the light-hearted moments. But examining their school years with clear eyes demands a reckoning. They were brilliant, yes, but they were also reckless. Their inventions brought joy, but they also brought harm. Their stunts made history, but they also endangered lives. And perhaps the most troubling truth of all is that, for the most part, no one ever told them to stop. Number 19. Ignoring Ginny's feelings. Fred and George Weasley were never cruel. Their mischief was legendary, their laughter infectious, and their loyalty to family unwavering. Yet within the walls of the burrow, and even under the enchanted ceilings of Hogwarts, there was a silence that went unnoticed. Not a silence of absence, but of emotional neglect. Ginny Weasley, the youngest of 7 and the only girl, often stood on the sidelines of her brother's jokes, her voice lost among the noise. Fred and George, the twins known for their antics, rarely paused long enough to listen to her with the seriousness she sometimes needed. They loved her, yes, but they failed to see her. From her earliest years, Ginny had always idolized her brothers. Bill, the cool and adventurous oldest, Charlie, strong and brave, Percy, strict but impressive in his own right, Ron, closest in age and often her companion. But Fred and George were a different force altogether, dazzling and chaotic, the center of attention in every room. They were the brothers she wanted to laugh with, to be seen by, to be included in their whirlwinds of charm and confidence. Yet too often they looked right past her, even when she needed them the most. The summer before her first year at Hogwarts, Ginny was barely 11, but the magic in her life had already begun to twist into something darker. She had written into an enchanted diary. A gift, she thought, something simple and comforting. Fred and George, if they noticed her growing paleness, her withdrawn stares, didn't say anything. They were busy filling the air with jokes and firecrackers, their attention constantly caught up in crafting their next prank or teasing Ron about Scabbers. Ginny was quiet, too quiet, but in a house that loud, silence went unnoticed. When the truth of the diary came out, that she had been possessed by Tom Riddle, that she had nearly died, the twins never truly acknowledged what had happened. They had no words for her trauma. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, after Ginny is rescued from the chamber, there is a brief scene where the family gathers around her. Mrs. Weasley weeps, clutching her daughter, while Arthur looks pale and stricken. Fred and George are there, of course, but they do not speak. No apology, no questions, no recognition of what Ginny had endured. It's not malice, it's blindness. To them, she's still their baby's sister. A girl to be teased and protected in equal measure, but not to be heard. That blindness extended to other moments, quieter ones, but no less hurtful. Ginny's childhood crush on Harry Potter was something Fred and George took as endless fuel for jokes. "Got yourself a girlfriend, Harry?" Fred had said with a grin, in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, when Ginny ran from the room at the sight of him. It was a small comment, perhaps meaningless to the twins, but devastating to Ginny. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was humiliated. And it wasn't the teasing from strangers that cut her, it was that her own brothers used her feelings as punchlines. Throughout her early years at Hogwarts, Ginny struggled to find a voice. Her first year had been stolen by Tom Riddle. Her second year was one of recovery, emotionally, psychologically, and socially. Fred and George remained who they always were, bold, unfiltered, unapologetically loud. But when Ginny began to step into her strength, joining Dumbledore's army, proving herself on the Quidditch pitch, they still saw her through the lens of childhood. They praised her, sure, but always with a tone of surprise, as if they hadn't expected she could be anything other than the shy, blushing girl they remembered. There is a moment in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix that underscores their disconnection. Ginny becomes the new seeker for Gryffindor when Harry is banned from Quidditch. Fred and George cheer her on, but even then it's laced with disbelief, as though her competence was unexpected. They hadn't realized she'd been sneaking into the broom shed since she was 6, practicing in secret. They didn't know her because they hadn't paid attention. It's telling that Ginny found deeper emotional bonds with people outside her immediate family. Hermione became her confidant, Luna her odd but loyal friend, and even Neville shared a mutual understanding of being overlooked. With them, Ginny could speak freely. Her wit, her courage, her fierce loyalty, these were qualities her brothers rarely commented on unless she was standing in front of them with a wand in hand or scoring a goal. Emotional complexity didn't fit into the twins' worldview, where life was often either hilarious or ridiculous. Even in Half-Blood Prince, when Ginny began dating Dean Thomas and later Harry himself, Fred and George responded not with support, but again with teasing. "So, you're going out with our sister now?" George had said, eyebrow raised. It was meant in jest, a warning cloaked in humour. but it revealed a deeper issue. Their concern for her manifested only when her romantic life intersected with their friend group, as if her emotions mattered only when they affected someone else they cared about. Ginny, in contrast, never asked for their protection. She was not looking for brothers to fight her battles. She was looking for them to see her, to acknowledge her pain when it mattered, to recognize her growth without mocking surprise, to support her without turning her into the subject of jokes. Instead, Fred and George were too often lost in their own spotlight. Their journey with Weasley's wizard wheezes took center stage, and though they included Ginny at times, testing products on her or letting her visit the shop, it was still with the air of older brothers patronizing a younger sibling. In Deathly Hallows, Fred and George continue to fight for the cause, risking their lives for the Order, for their family, for freedom. They are brave and selfless. But when Fred dies during the Battle of Hogwarts, the pain that radiates through the family is unspeakable. For Ginny, that pain is layered. She mourns the brother she adored, the one she'd laughed with but who had rarely heard her deepest cries. There is love there, undeniably, but also a wound, an ache for the relationship that never quite grew into maturity. The Weasley twins' emotional deafness to Ginny's inner life is not a condemnation of their character, but a reflection of a broader truth. In many families, the youngest is often dismissed, their feelings downplayed, their insights underestimated. Ginny wasn't weak. But the people closest to her didn't always know how strong she was because they weren't looking closely enough. When she stood at the heart of the Battle of Hogwarts, fighting alongside Harry, Neville, and Luna, she was no longer the girl in the corner of the room. She was fire and resolve. She had become the warrior her family never quite expected her to be. And though Fred would never live to see the full measure of her strength, there is a quiet tragedy in knowing that he could have, had he paid attention earlier. Ginny was never the comic relief. She was never just Ron's little sister. Her arc was one of the most understated but powerful in the series, from the shy girl in the corner to the woman who stood against evil and held her ground. Fred and George never disrespected her maliciously, but they failed to treat her with the emotional respect she had earned. And that absence left its mark. In the quiet moments after battle, when the dust had settled and the dead were counted, Ginny's grief was likely complicated. She had lost a brother, but also she had lost the chance to hear him say, "I understand now, I'm proud of you." That silence echoes louder than any joke ever told. There's a cruelty in laughter when it comes at the expense of vulnerability. Ginny's crush on Harry was not something to be mocked. It was a raw, real expression of affection during a time when she felt invisible. Her silence in her first year was not shyness, it was trauma, and her defiance in later years was not rebellion, it was survival. Fred and George, for all their brilliance, never fully saw the battle she fought alone. In families, love is often assumed. Of course they love you, people say. But love is not just protection, it is recognition, it is listening, it is knowing when to stop laughing and start asking questions. Fred and George rarely did, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't understand that caring requires attention. And Ginny, fierce, brave, bright Ginny, deserved more than laughter. She deserved to be heard. Number 20, mocking others without reason. Fred and George Weasley were icons of Hogwarts mischief, the twin jesters who turned corridors into stages and attention into an art form. Their flair for fireworks, enchanted sweets, and spontaneous chaos painted them as lovable rebels. But beneath the smoke and laughter, their pranks often revealed a less charming truth, a streak of cruelty that sometimes targeted those who could least defend themselves. It was not just about pulling tricks on bullies or authority figures. Sometimes the twins directed their humor at the vulnerable. And in those moments, the magic of their mirth dulled. Luna Lovegood, a Ravenclaw girl with wide eyes and an open heart, often found herself on the receiving end of Hogwarts' collective ridicule. Her odd beliefs, dreamy voice, and eccentric wardrobe made her a magnet for mockery. Most students snickered behind her back, whispering words like "Loony Lovegood," as though her kindness and individuality were something to be pitied. What's tragic is that Fred and George, despite their own experiences as outliers, joined in that cruelty instead of standing against it. Luna was never unkind. She never mocked anyone, never raised her voice, never tried to belong by putting others down. She floated through the castle like a benevolent spirit, misunderstood but never malicious. Yet Fred and George, who could have extended an olive branch, chose instead to laugh with the crowd. Their jokes about her spectre specs and nargles weren't always outright insults, but they reinforced the narrative that Luna was odd and therefore amusing. It wasn't just the laughter that stung, it was who was laughing. In their 5th year, during one of the many evenings in the Gryffindor common room, Fred had enchanted a stack of copies of The Quibbler, Luna's father's magazine, to sprout legs and dance around chanting nonsense. It drew roars of laughter from nearby students. Luna, sitting quietly by the fireplace, watched her father's publication reduced to a joke. She said nothing, only smiled faintly, as if she had long grown used to being ridiculed. But her fingers trembled slightly when she picked up the enchanted pages afterward. It was a fleeting moment, unnoticed by most. But cruelty, when wrapped in laughter, is still cruelty. In Order of the Phoenix, we see Luna stand beside Harry, loyal when few others are. She believes him, she supports him. Yet earlier that same year, Fred had joked that Luna must be keeping rackspurts in her ears, otherwise how else could she believe the things she says? It got a laugh from Lee Jordan and even Ginny, but that one line, buried in the noise of banter, carried the familiar sting of exclusion. The twins weren't merely mocking ideas, they were mocking the girl who dared to believe them. Fred and George often prided themselves on mocking those in power, Umbridge, Filch, Percy. But there's a fine line between mocking authority and mocking the isolated. Luna wasn't powerful. She was already a subject of laughter for being herself. Joining in didn't challenge the status quo, it reinforced it. It's easy to laugh at the ministry. It takes character to stand beside the misfits. And in this, the twins failed. Their behavior wasn't limited to Luna. In their 3rd year, they once slipped a dung bomb into a group of first-year Hufflepuffs just to see who would run first. Ernie Macmillan, who tried to take the blame, ended up with detention, while Fred later told the Gryffindors it was just a laugh. But for the younger students, it wasn't funny, it was humiliating. They didn't understand why they were chosen, and in truth there was no reason, just amusement at someone else's expense. It becomes more troubling when we realize that Fred and George had the social capital to stop this kind of behavior. If they had shown Luna respect, if they had told the younger students that oddness is not weakness, it could have shifted the tide. But they didn't. They laughed, they played to the crowd, they became part of the problem they were otherwise so adept at undermining. In Goblet of Fire, when Ron dates Padma Patil for the Yule Ball and spends the night ignoring her, Fred and George are among the first to mock the situation, joking about how Ron's date looked like she'd rather be eating a flobber worm. While it seems like harmless sibling banter, Padma's discomfort becomes the punchline. She's reduced to a joke, her feelings invisible. It's another pattern, laughter, at the cost of the overlooked. The jokes didn't stop with students either. In Prisoner of Azkaban, they invented the Tongue toffee and tricked Dudley Dursley into eating it, causing his tongue to swell grotesquely. While the Dursleys were undeniably awful to Harry, turning a child's body into a weapon for humiliation crosses an ethical line. It was a moment of triumph for Fred and George, yes, but not a moment of compassion. Comedy that inflicts pain, especially when it becomes a spectacle, should give us pause. It's tempting to romanticize the twins. They were brave during the war. They risked their lives. They made Umbridge's life miserable, but goodness is not a shield against criticism. One can be brave and flawed. One can stand against tyranny and still harm the quiet odd girl sitting alone in the common room. Heroism in one sphere does not absolve bullying in another. That duality is important to acknowledge if we are to see these characters in full light. George, after Fred's death, is remembered as quieter, changed, and perhaps grief brings reflection. But before the war, their humour was a form of dominance. They had the luxury to joke because they were popular, because people laughed with them, not at them. Luna didn't have that luxury. Neville didn't either, though the twins largely spared him. But Seamus, with his sometimes clumsy attempts at being liked, was not always safe from their jabs. They made fun of his failed spells often, turning his singed eyebrows into running jokes. When Percy became estranged from the family, Fred and George called him names, mocked his ambition, and made public jokes at his expense. Percy was certainly arrogant, but the cruelty with which they treated him, especially when he returned during the Battle of Hogwarts, spoke volumes. They didn't offer understanding, they offered mockery. Percy's desire to serve the ministry may have been misguided, but it was not evil. Yet Fred and George treated it as betrayal deserving not of discussion, but derision. In Half-Blood Prince, their joke shop flourished, and their products became part of Hogwarts culture. Some were harmless, others less so. Skiving snack boxes caused vomiting and fainting. The love potions they sold were essentially means of manipulating consent, and Fred once joked that Romilda Vane should dose Harry good and proper. These are not harmless jokes. They reflect a lack of empathy, a blindness to how actions ripple outward. Comedy, again, used without conscience. Lee Jordan, their closest friend, often echoed their humour. But even he paused once when Fred suggested turning a Slytherin's robe into a tutu mid-class. "Is that really necessary?" he asked. Fred just grinned. But that moment, a brief flicker of discomfort in their partner in pranks, suggests not everyone laughed as freely. Not everyone was blind to the damage. There were moments when the twins showed kindness. They gave Harry the Marauder's map. They told Ginny she wasn't to blame for the Chamber of Secrets. But these gestures make their casual cruelty toward others more confusing. Why could they be so good in one moment and so dismissive in another? Why could they extend friendship to Harry and contempt to Luna? The inconsistency reveals the danger of selective empathy. It is not enough to be kind to your friends. The true test lies in how you treat the forgotten. Even after death, Fred is remembered fondly, and he deserves to be. His sacrifice, his humour, his love for his family, they are real, but memory must be honest. In the tapestry of Hogwarts, Fred and George were not only weavers of joy, sometimes they were threads of exclusion, sometimes their laughter covered tears. There is a passage in Order of the Phoenix where Luna says to Harry, "People expect you to have cooler friends than Luna Lovegood." It is a heartbreaking line. It is also deeply revealing. Luna knows she is mocked. She knows people don't want to be seen with her. And in that world, Fred and George could have done something rare. They could have laughed with her, not at her. They could have defended her oddities as wonder, not weakness. But they didn't. And that is the story often left untold when we speak of their legacy, not to tarnish them, but to complete them. To see not only the fireworks in the sky, but the shadows they cast on the ground below. Number 21, selling banned items. The moment Dolores Umbridge tightened her grip on Hogwarts, declaring decrees and asserting absolute control, the castle's atmosphere shifted into a breathless hush of obedience. Classrooms dulled into echo chambers of her doctrine, punishments turned from detentions into tortures cloaked in pink lace. And in this stifling environment, it was not Dumbledore's army that first struck the blow of defiance. It was Fred and George Weasley, who chose laughter as their weapon and chaos as their creed. But their rebellion wasn't just mischief. It was calculated subversion, carried out through an underground trade of banned magical items. In the bowels of the Gryffindor common room, behind curtained alcoves and silencing spells, the twins curated what could only be described as an illegal bazaar. Skiving snack boxes, canary creams, nosebleed nougat, all disguised as innocent candy, were passed from hand to hand like black market contraband. Yet what appeared playful on the surface was often dangerous in function. Their wares didn't just prank, they altered states of health, tampered with bodily functions, and in some cases incapacitated the user. The joke was real, but so was the risk. One particularly alarming case involved a Hufflepuff fourth year named Lester Ashcombe, who, eager to skip a double period of history of magic, consumed half of a nosebleed nougat. Unfortunately, Lester had a pre-existing condition. He was prone to severe sinus bleeds. The product, never tested under such circumstances, resulted in a prolonged hemorrhage that left Madame Pomfrey scrambling for blood-replenishing potions. Fred and George, when confronted, were said to have looked genuinely surprised but unapologetic. "It's not our fault people don't read the fine print," Fred had mumbled, though the fine print had never been shown to the customer. They operated out of their enchanted trunks, which opened into compartments of unimaginable storage capacity, each filled with prototypes, invoices, and payment ledgers. These weren't just pranksters playing at rebellion, they were businessmen establishing a shadow economy within a school that had outlawed even whispered dissent. Dolores Umbridge had posted Educational Decree number 27, stating, "All Weasley products are henceforth banned. Possession shall result in expulsion." But that only inflated their demand. Students began to see the banned items as trophies of resistance. The more severe the decree, the more valuable the item. Some professors were aware and chose to turn a blind eye. Even Flitwick, ever the champion of proper spellwork, was seen chuckling as a student fainted from a fainting fancy's overdose. But there were limits to tolerance. McGonagall, for all her unspoken support of rebellion, had once confiscated a stack of decoy detonators after one detonated in her office, sending a full shelf of Transfiguration textbooks flying. "There is a difference between undermining tyranny," she muttered sternly, "and endangering life and limb." What remained troubling was not simply that the twins defied Umbridge, but how unchecked their empire became. There was no regulation, no screening, and no care for who used what and why. A student with social anxiety took a bite-banned biscuit and collapsed in the hallway, unable to form words for 3 hours. Another suffered minor magical burns after testing a failed firework lollipop prototype. These weren't isolated incidents, they were quiet casualties of a war cloaked in laughter. One might argue that their products, however dangerous, were preferable to the brutality of Umbridge's punishments. After all, she had carved into Harry's hand with a blood quill. She was, without a doubt, a villain. But to call Fred and George heroes without nuance ignores the duality of their actions. Resistance is not inherently noble when its methods tread the same reckless paths as those it defies. They didn't distribute healing potions or protective amulets. They sold items meant to distract, disorient, and destroy order. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," was Fred's last request to the poltergeist, before they fled the castle in a blaze of enchanted fireworks. It was poetic, anarchic, and undeniably spectacular. The students cheered, but what they were cheering for wasn't justice, it was spectacle. The skies of the Great Hall had exploded in technicolor dragons, and Catherine wheels bounced along the corridor ceilings. But underneath the marvel was a bitter truth. The school descended further into lawlessness. Without the twins' underground structure, students turned to imitating their devices. Injuries increased. Peeves, emboldened, became uncontrollable. Even Filch, as cruel as he was, suffered a fall down the stairs due to a rogue, tripping Jinx hidden inside a piece of extendable ear packaging. In Order of the Phoenix, the narration details, Fred and George turned their backs on Umbridge and walked away. People stared. Then someone started clapping, and soon the whole school was applauding. It was a moment that read like triumph. But in the shadows behind the page, the school was being held hostage by two conflicting forces, tyranny and chaos. There was no middle ground, no oversight, just extremes. Their legacy would go on to become Weasley's Wizard Wheezes in Diagon Alley, a massive success. But the ethical implications of their school days linger like smoke from one of their dragon dung firecrackers. What did it mean that they chose to unleash power without discipline in a place filled with children? That they capitalized on oppression not by offering sanctuary, but by selling weaponized joy? What if one of their victims had died? Even Hermione, known for her clear moral compass, often expressed discomfort. She once told Harry, "You know, Fred and George have always pushed the limits, but this is getting out of hand." She wasn't wrong, but her voice, as often happened, was drowned out by laughter and excitement. In a world where laughter was rare, even the dangerous kind was cherished. George, after losing Fred in the Battle of Hogwarts, would later speak of their time during Umbridge's reign with a nostalgic glow. But memory is kind to rebellion. It edits out the nosebleeds, the confusion, the collateral damage. What remains are the cheers, the explosions, the awe. But in reality, they had sold thunder to children and turned the corridors into minefields of magical unpredictability. There was also the issue of intent. They weren't just resisting, they were experimenting. Hogwarts, under Umbridge, became their lab. Students were test subjects. Some wares had predictable effects, others not. The cheek-sneak chewing gum meant to detect lies ended up causing temporary muteness in 3 students. The anti-Umbridge posters enchanted with duplicating charms multiplied endlessly until Peeves had to chase them down the staircases, screaming for mercy. None of these results were part of a careful strategy. They were the misfires of uncontrolled magic. Their influence also stretched into manipulation. Students who couldn't afford their products were sometimes offered trades or future debts. 3 nuts and I'll give you half a fainting fancy. Want the whole thing? Find me a vial of beetle eyes from Snape's cupboard. They created a barter system that began to blur into exploitation. The poorer students took the risks. The richer ones paid for guaranteed results. When it came time for their final act, the grand escape, the chaos reached its peak. Filch was left buried under a mountain of confiscated goods that had reactivated, creating a chain reaction of magical incidents. The suits of armor began to sing, the paintings revolted, and Umbridge, wild-eyed and hoarse, was found screaming at the banisters, trying to hex shadows. But even in her unraveling, one had to wonder, had the twins become her reflection, just in different colors? Fred and George, the books later recalled, left behind a legacy of laughter, but also a legacy of recklessness. In their refusal to be controlled, they refused all control. Hogwarts became a battleground of extremes. The middle path, the one of quiet resistance, planning, of education and unity, was forgotten in the roar of explosions. Neville Longbottom, once clumsy and quiet, emerged stronger by fighting through fear, not by dodging class with a nosebleed nougat. Luna Lovegood endured torment by holding on to her truth, not with joke shop devices. Real resistance was not as glamorous. It was painful, unseen, honest. But Fred and George, for all their brilliance, often blurred the line between heroism and harm. And though the magical community would come to adore them, to line up at their store in Diagon Alley for boxes of Peruvian instant darkness powder and you-know-poo, the shadow of their Hogwarts days still lingers. The question remains, when children are armed with chaos, and chaos is sold with a wink and a grin, where does laughter end and danger begin? Number 22, blind belief in their own righteousness. Fred and George Weasley were brilliant minds wrapped in jokes and laughter, but beneath their radiant charm lay a dangerous kind of conviction, the kind that often ignored the voices of reason. They were not cruel, nor reckless in the traditional sense. They were, above all, unshakably confident in their instincts. That confidence made them unstoppable in the face of fear, but also deaf to the warnings of others. Their twin bond served as an echo chamber, reinforcing their shared certainty. When one believed something, the other followed, and together they became a force of will, rarely questioned, seldom doubted. Their disregard for authority was not just mischief, but a philosophy. They challenged the world on their own terms. When Dolores Umbridge took over Hogwarts, it wasn't fear or caution that ruled the corridors. It was Fred and George's rebellion. They saw themselves as champions of justice, avengers cloaked in fireworks and daring. And in many ways they were. Their departure from Hogwarts became legendary, a symbol of resistance. But behind that glamour stood an essential truth. They listened to no one. Hermione had warned them about pushing too far. "You can't keep doing this," she had said, voice taut with concern as they plotted more disruptions. But they had laughed. They always laughed. And then they did it anyway. Even Percy, who had long fallen out with the family, once tried to reason with them during a particularly tense summer. He spoke with a voice filled with weary responsibility, trying to warn them about how the ministry would never tolerate open defiance. But Percy's warnings, backed by cold logic and insider knowledge, were brushed aside like an old family photo gathering dust. Fred and George did not need permission to believe in their path. They saw themselves as revolutionaries, not rule followers, and to listen would be to yield. One can admire their spirit without ignoring its consequences. Their joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, flourished during dark times, bringing laughter to children in a world torn by fear. But the very items they sold were dangerously potent. Extendable ears, skiving snack boxes, instant darkness powder, all ingenious, yet many were borderline illegal. When Hermione warned them about the risks of such products falling into the wrong hands, they dismissed her. She was just being Hermione, they thought, always worrying. But they sold the items anyway. There was one moment during the battle against Umbridge's regime when their certainty nearly backfired. Fred had snuck a collection of enchanted fireworks into the Great Hall, set to go off precisely during one of Umbridge's new inspections. It was a spectacular display of defiance. Catherine wheels burst into flames, dragons roared overhead, and a giant firework shaped like a rocket chicken chased Umbridge down the corridor. Students cheered, but in the chaos, a second-year Hufflepuff girl, startled and frightened, tripped and hit her head on the stone floor. She was fine, thankfully, after Madame Pomfrey intervened, but Hermione had been furious. "You're lucky she didn't break her skull," she snapped at them. They apologized, of course they did, but even then they believed the chaos had been worth it. Fred and George were not villains. They were not arrogant in the sense of Draco Malfoy, or entitled like Zachariah Smith. But they had a particular kind of tunnel vision, the belief that if they felt something was right, then it was. When Harry began his campaign to form Dumbledore's army, the twins supported him wholeheartedly. But when the group faced serious danger, they pushed for riskier moves, more sabotage, more stunts, louder messages. Harry had his hands full already with Voldemort's connection in his head, but Fred and George made no room for caution. They couldn't see the bigger picture. They didn't want to. Their blind confidence could be comforting. In the burrow, when the world felt like it might collapse, the twins' humour was an anchor. Molly Weasley often worried herself into exhaustion, and the twins would swoop in with jokes about gnomes forming trade unions or Charlie breeding fire-breathing chickens. But behind her laughter, Molly feared for them. She once asked them to tone down their defiance. "Just for a while," she pleaded, especially with the Order of the Phoenix under scrutiny. But they couldn't help themselves. Their belief in their mission overrode everything, even their mother's quiet desperation. When they tested products on themselves, it was bravery cloaked in comedy. But when they tested them on others, on classmates or unwitting siblings, it became a recklessness. Ron once turned a violent shade of purple after eating an experimental candy Fred had left on the table. They laughed. "You should have known not to touch it," Fred said, but it had been placed where anyone could have taken it. In a war-torn world, such carelessness could have been fatal. Percy, always the family's black sheep, once said something that stuck. You think rules are jokes, but sometimes they protect people. It was a line delivered in anger, yes, but it was not wrong. The twins believed in freedom, not structure. And that belief, while noble, was often blind. They refused to see that even rebellion needs responsibility. During the Second Wizarding War, Fred and George provided the public with much-needed levity. Their inventions helped in skirmishes, their decoy detonators became tools for espionage, and their joke shop evolved into a secret stronghold of resistance. But even then, they didn't always consider the consequences. When Death Eaters began raiding homes, one of their more dangerous products, a portable swamp, was used by a teenage boy trying to block a hallway and save his family. It backfired. He was caught, tortured. The twins were horrified when they found out, but the damage had already been done. Fred's death, sudden, sharp, irreversible, was the cruelest consequence of a life lived on their own terms. He died laughing, as some would say, side by side with Percy, the brother he once mocked. It was a noble death, yes, but it left George fractured. And in the silence that followed, one had to wonder, did George ever question the years of decisions made on sheer conviction? The fireworks, the defiance, the dismissals of warnings, were they worth it? Hermione, years later, when asked about the twins, once said, "They were brilliant, but they never knew when to stop." Her voice carried both admiration and sorrow. She had tried to advise them about their products, their choices, their tendency to mock caution. She wasn't always right, but she was never listened to. Even Albus Dumbledore, a man who saw the value of rebellion, had once raised an eyebrow at one of their more dangerous inventions and said, "Mischief is fine, as long as it knows the difference between courage and recklessness." But the twins, blinded by their charm, never took it as more than a compliment. In the end, Fred and George's legacy is one of brilliance, laughter, and undeniable loss. Their story is a reminder that even the brightest minds need guidance, that even the most confident hearts must sometimes pause and listen. Their strength was their certainty. Their flaw was their refusal to ever doubt it. George, left behind, carried the silence like a wound, the empty half of a sentence that would never be finished, the joke that would never be told. In the years after the war, he ran the shop alone, kept Fred's name on the door, and smiled through the pain. But one could see it. In the pause between jokes, in the way he sometimes looked at a product and shook his head. The question he would never ask aloud. What if we had listened? Their story, though full of colour and fireworks, is deeply human. It's about how belief, unchecked, becomes a kind of blindness. Fred and George weren't just mischief makers, they were visionaries who ignored warnings, heroes who sometimes made the wrong call, brothers who paid a terrible price. And that, in the quiet corners of Hogwarts and the silent spaces of Diagon Alley, is the truth they left behind. Number 23, ignoring moral boundaries. Fred and George Weasley were never ordinary children. From their earliest appearances at Hogwarts, the twins displayed a particular delight in disruption, in chaos, cloaked in laughter. While their pranks brought moments of levity to a school often shadowed by darker forces, there was always a thread of danger in their humour, an edge that, when traced closely, led to a troubling disregard for the moral weight of their actions. It was not simply that they liked to laugh. It was that they were willing to laugh at anything and anyone, regardless of consequence. In their 5th year, during Dolores Umbridge's cruel reign at Hogwarts, Fred and George became heroes of a kind. Their rebellion, setting off fireworks, enchanting corridors, vanishing into the sky on broomsticks, was met with applause. But even in their most triumphant moment, they left behind a mess not just of scorch marks and pranked inquisitorial squad members, but of frightened first years and panicked staff. The chaos may have symbolized defiance, but it also disrupted classes, injured paintings, and left younger students shaken. The line between heroism and irresponsibility had been thoroughly blurred. Their joke products, initially seen as harmless novelties, grew increasingly disturbing. Among their earliest experiments were canary creams, which transformed the consumer into a giant canary, feathers and all, before reverting them to normal. Harmless enough, perhaps, but their line quickly evolved. One item, the Tun-Tung toffee, caused Dudley Dursley's tongue to swell 4 feet long. Mrs. Weasley was horrified. "It could have suffocated him," she screamed. But Fred and George laughed. They showed no remorse for the physical danger they had caused. It wasn't just a prank. It was a transformation of the human body without consent, a deeply personal violation cloaked in sugary mischief. There is a particularly unsettling moment when a younger Hogwarts student, unnamed in the text but described as a small boy with a terrified expression, became the unintended victim of one of their skiving snack boxes. The boy had attempted a fainting fancy unaware of the full effects. He collapsed in the corridor, unconscious, blood trickling from his nose. When Madame Pomfrey found him, she was furious, not at the boy, but at the twins. She demanded they cease selling such dangerous items within the school walls, but they didn't stop. They simply went underground, selling their wares in secret, dismissing the incident as a misunderstanding. The twins were not deterred by the suffering caused, only by the possibility of getting caught. Even their celebrated exit from Hogwarts was laced with cruelty. One of their parting shots was to hex the door to Umbridge's office so that it would periodically belch loudly and refuse to open. But their hex did not discriminate. It locked out terrified students who had been summoned for detentions, often involving blood quills and psychological abuse. The twins did not stop to ask whether their prank would help or hurt those already under siege. They wanted spectacle, not safety. There's a moment in Half-Blood Prince that often goes unnoticed, yet it speaks volumes. A 6th-year girl named Sally Ann Perks was rushed to the hospital wing after sampling a puking pastille during a moment of peer pressure. She vomited uncontrollably for hours. When Madame Pomfrey confronted Fred and George at their shop in Diagon Alley, they shrugged. "She took it voluntarily," Fred said, according to the narration. But did she understand what it would do to her? Did she know the pastille would override her body's function so violently? The issue wasn't legality, it was ethics. Their store, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, became an empire of mischief, but it also became a center for weaponized comedy. The twins sold shield cloaks and decoy detonators, yes, but also nosebleed nougats, bruise powder, and their darker experiments with Peruvian instant darkness powder. The latter was smuggled into the castle by Death Eaters and used in the attempted murder of Albus Dumbledore. The powder created a pitch-black void so complete that no spell could penetrate it. Draco Malfoy used it to disappear from a hallway after cursing Katie Bell. Fred and George may not have intended this, but their lack of control over the distribution of their creations enabled real harm. They had unleashed tools they didn't fully contain or consider. One student, name recorded in a footnote of an early draft of the Aura's educational archive, suffered a severe allergic reaction to the twins' experimental edibles line. He'd tried a crumpled cream puff designed to make the eater's face temporarily cave inward for comic effect. Instead, he experienced prolonged breathing issues and trauma. Fred and George, upon hearing this, offered the boy a voucher for a free item from their store. Again, no apology, no acknowledgement that what they did was wrong. Just more jokes, more distractions. They often aimed their humor at others' weaknesses. Ron, their own brother, was frequently the target of barbs about his fear of spiders, his poor Quidditch performance, and his lack of romantic experience. One might write this off as typical sibling teasing, but in one instance during Goblet of Fire, They magicked Ron's dress robes to turn violently pink and sparkle during dinner, humiliating him in front of the Durmstrang students. Molly Weasley reprimanded them quietly, but the damage had been done. It wasn't just laughter, it was humiliation masquerading as entertainment. They ridiculed Percy for his ambition and seriousness, failing to understand or care that their mockery drove him deeper into isolation. Percy's decision to sever ties with his family during the Ministry's anti-Dumbledore campaign was tragic, but not inexplicable. The twins were relentless in their jabs, turning his choices into punchlines, never considering that Percy might be struggling under pressure, confused, or scared. In their need for laughs, the twins overlooked emotional boundaries. When Ginny was recovering from her possession by Tom Riddle in her first year, Fred and George joked about her dark and mysterious ways and talking to snakes in her sleep. Ginny smiled weakly, but those close to her noticed how quickly she excused herself. Trauma for the twins became yet another stage for humour, a mine to extract laughter from, rather than a scar to be treated with care. Perhaps the darkest example lies in their casual use of fear, when they discovered that a first-year Hufflepuff student was terrified of heights. They enchanted her broom to fly uncontrollably during a flying lesson. The student ended up dangling from a tree branch, sobbing, while the twins howled with laughter from the sidelines. Madam Hooch nearly expelled them, but the memory faded and the twins remained. Their popularity eclipsed the cruelty embedded in their jokes. They tested products on animals, sometimes on Crookshanks or on rats from the Hogwarts kitchens. In one case, they enchanted a ferret to continuously shrink and expand like a balloon. The animal became disoriented and bit its own tail off. Fred dismissed the scene as one of the funniest things I've ever seen. George agreed. No sense of compassion, no awareness that living beings aren't props for humour. Even in the context of the war, when the stakes were higher and the losses were real, Fred and George retained this flippant attitude. When Lupin mourned Tonks's injuries after a skirmish with Death Eaters, George quipped that, at least the baby'll have cool parents. Fred added, could be worse, could have married Percy. The room fell silent. Jokes had no place there, but the twins didn't seem to care. They laughed at the boundary, as if it were an illusion they were immune to. When George lost his ear during the flight of the 7 Potters, Fred laughed. You look like a right idiot, he said. George replied in kind. It was how they coped, but the moment marked something deeper, an inability to process suffering without turning it into a punchline. Their entire emotional framework hinged on humour as a shield, a deflection. But shields, when misused, can become weapons. Their products were never regulated. They never submitted their joke items to oversight. There was no testing beyond their circle of friends and occasional schoolmates. They had no licenses, no health warnings, no disclaimers. The ethics of their business model were always murky, and yet they were beloved, showered with praise for bringing joy. But joy at what cost? There's no question that Fred and George were brave. Their role in the resistance, their contributions to the war effort, and their sacrifices were real, but their bravery did not erase the moments where they crossed moral lines. Humor is a powerful tool, but when wielded carelessly, it cuts just as deep as any hex. Their failure was not in laughing. Their failure was in laughing at pain. In Deathly Hallows, during the final battle, Fred was killed by an explosion while laughing. The irony is brutal. A boy who made the world laugh died in the middle of a joke. For many, this sealed him as a hero. But in examining his legacy, we must also ask uncomfortable questions. What do we forgive in the name of humour? What pain do we dismiss when the one causing it is smiling? Fred and George's lives were performances, their identities rooted in the reactions they could provoke. But performance without accountability becomes manipulation. Their disregard for the suffering of others, even in jest, challenges the narrative of the harmless pranksters. They were more than jesters. They were provocateurs with power, and sometimes they used that power recklessly. They were beloved by many, but that love came with blind spots. It ignored the tears behind the laughter, the students who suffered quietly, the classmates who became punchlines. In the world of magic, laughter is a spell, but every spell has its cost, and the twins, for all their genius, rarely stopped to count it. Number 24. Inability to show vulnerability. Fred and George Weasley were never just the comic relief of the Harry Potter books. They were architects of levity in the darkest of times, inventors of joy in a world growing more dangerous with each page. Yet behind every explosion of canary creams and every whispered charm that made a hallway erupt in laughter, there was a calculated silence, a willful suppression of something more fragile. For all their mirth, the twins were nearly incapable of showing personal vulnerability. Their refusal or inability to reveal pain or doubt left an invisible wall between them and the readers, one made not of stone but of jokes, laughter, and perfectly timed mischief. The most vivid proof of this comes during the events of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Fred and George staged the most spectacular act of rebellion Hogwarts has ever seen. Firework dragons soaring through the corridors, a portable swamp blooming in a hallway, and a bold escape on broomsticks into the London sky. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," George calls back, and Peeves salutes them with a rare moment of alliance. The castle erupts in chaos, laughter, and awe, but not once do the twins reveal any deeper emotional reason for this grand exit. They don't speak of frustration, of fear, or even of disillusionment with the world they're leaving behind. Their performance is just that, a carefully curated spectacle, louder than any confession, bigger than any tear. Their silence becomes more haunting when placed beside the suffering of their siblings. Percy, for all his flaws, openly grieves the rift between himself and the family. Ron, often insecure, shows pain in his inadequacy next to Harry. Ginny, once shy, grows into fierce emotional honesty. Even Charlie and Bill, who remain in the background, are human in their mentions. Fred and George, though? They are stage-ready, always. Their grief over Percy's betrayal, their worry about their father's safety during the attack on the Ministry, and their dread of Voldemort's rise, it all remains cloaked in comedy or unspoken altogether. And yet it isn't that Fred and George feel nothing, they simply never let it rise to the surface. When Arthur Weasley is attacked by Nagini, the Weasley family gathers in Grimmauld Place, shell-shocked. No one spoke much at breakfast, the text tells us. Even then, Fred and George do not crack. They help pack food and do their part, but they don't articulate fear or anguish. They simply press forward with the same determination to distract others, perhaps hoping distraction will save themselves too. The twins smile but never mourn, not aloud. In Half-Blood Prince, the war finally breaches the walls of normalcy. The joke shop, their dream made real, becomes more than a shop. It becomes a symbol of resistance, stocked with shield hats and decoy detonators. But behind this business move is the grim acknowledgement of a world falling apart. Do Fred and George reflect on the change? Do they confide their terror? No. Instead, they sell their wares with the same charisma, shrouding their fears in the spectacle of glittering storefronts. "You're joking, Percy." "You actually are joking," Fred says when Percy coldly enters the burrow after Bill's mauling. It's sarcasm, yes, but also pain buried beneath mockery. It's the closest Fred gets to revealing his heartbreak, and even then, it is layered in irony. Consider the moment of Bill's attack. While the family reels in horror, Molly sobbing, Fleur making her unexpected declaration of loyalty, Fred and George are again present, but their reactions are less explored. They make quips. George mentions how Bill will be even more worth looking at now. It's a joke with an edge of cruelty, and perhaps that's the point. The joke is armor, the joke is control, and vulnerability is chaos, something the twins, for all their pranks, seem afraid to touch. It's not that Fred and George never care. Quite the opposite. They care deeply, but their love manifests in action, not in emotional availability. They protect with tricks, they comfort with distraction. Their laughter is a shield against sorrow. In Goblet of Fire, when Harry is chosen as champion, everyone doubts him, even Ron. But Fred and George are quick to offer support. They make light of the situation, yes, but their loyalty is immediate and unwavering. Still, they never stop to ask Harry how he feels. They assume strength. They reward silence. When George loses his ear during the Battle of the Seven Potters, it's a moment ripe for emotional breakthrough. Here is real pain, real injury, real horror. And yet, even bleeding and bandaged, George says, saint-like, I'm holy. Holy, Fred, get it? It's a pun, yes, but it's also a tragedy. Even at the brink of mutilation, he cannot drop the mask. Fred joins in, laughing. They laugh together. The world spins off its axis, but the twins remain on stage. Their pain is hidden in puns, their grief buried beneath a well-timed line. This inability to express vulnerability also stifles intimacy. We never read of the twins having close emotional connections outside of each other. While Ron develops friendships, love, jealousy, fear, and even rage, George and Fred exist almost in a vacuum. Their bond is a world of two, and even then, it's one of performance. Fred never cries. George never confesses fear, not to their mother, not to their father, not to each other. Their jokes create distance. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when Sirius Black escapes and the Weasleys are terrified for Harry, the twins keep up their mischief. They don't sit with Harry in his anxiety. They give him the Marauder's map instead, a tool, not a comfort. Their idea of help is action, not empathy. They arm Harry with secrets, but never talk to him about what it feels like to be hunted. Never ask if he's scared. In that same book, the twins joke about Percy's ambition, about Ron's rat, about everything, but they never process grief over Cedric, not truly. Even in Goblet of Fire, the trauma of Voldemort's return hits everyone like a shockwave. Harry is silent and numb. The twins? Still business as usual, still laughing, still pretending. Maybe they're not pretending for others, maybe it's for themselves. The contrast becomes unbearable in Deathly Hallows. The stakes are clear, the war is real, death is near, and the twins are still joking. In the Burrow, as the wedding is prepared and the sky grows darker each day, Fred and George remain the spirits of the household. It's admirable, in a way, how they hold the mood aloft like two human lanterns. But it also begs the question, what are they hiding? Is this resilience or fear? The truth is whispered in Fred's death, a single, thunderous moment in Deathly Hallows. 1 minute he is alive, mid-laugh. The next, the world explodes and Fred is gone. And that was the last time Ron, Harry, and Hermione ever saw Fred alive. There is no fanfare, no long goodbye, no final confession, just silence. The curtain falls mid-performance. George is broken, but even then his grief is silent. The books never describe a sobbing George, never explore his shattered sense of identity. He loses not just a brother, but a partner, a twin, a mirror. And still, George doesn't speak of the pain. He continues on, opens the shop again, smiles for customers, marries, lives. But something is missing, and readers feel it, the weight of a grief never voiced, a wound never named. This absence of vulnerability may be why Fred and George are so beloved and so tragic. They represent escape, hope, and courage, but also denial. Their greatest magic trick was never the fireworks. It was convincing everyone, including themselves, that they didn't feel pain, that humor could erase fear, that laughter could replace grief. It couldn't. It never could. And perhaps this is the final tragedy of Fred and George Weasley. Not that one of them died, but that we never truly got to know either of them, not deeply, not fully. Their refusal to expose their hearts meant their true selves were always just out of reach, veiled behind the smoke of a joke, the sparkle of a prank, or the echo of a well-timed laugh. Their legacy is enormous. No one forgets them. But in that memory there lingers a shadow. What could they have been had they ever allowed themselves to break character? What might Fred have said if he ever stopped laughing long enough to cry? What might George have become if he ever allowed himself to be seen, not just admired? In the end, Fred and George Weasley were brilliant, radiant, unforgettable, and unknowable. Their silence was not emptiness, but protection, and their laughter, as loud as it was, always carried the quiet sound of something left unsaid. Number 25. Dropping out as a dangerous role model. Fred and George Weasley did not simply walk out of Hogwarts, they exploded out of it in a blaze of fireworks, rebellion, and dragon-shaped pyrotechnics. The moment remains etched in the collective memory of readers as a victorious cry for freedom, an exhilarating release from the tyranny of Dolores Umbridge. Yet beneath the sparks and laughter lay a message that was both seductive and, for some, dangerously misleading. School is not necessary, education is optional. And if you're clever enough, bold enough, and funny enough, you can abandon the system and still succeed. The twins, in all their glory, left more than scorch marks in the hallways. They left behind an idea that has never quite been questioned. At first glance, their decision to abandon school and chase entrepreneurial dreams seems like the ultimate validation of nonconformity. They were never top students, never prefects, and rarely seen without a smirk. But they had vision. Their joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, was a testament to creative genius and tireless experimentation. Their products weren't simple pranks, they were innovations, some of which had real magical merit. Skiving snack boxes manipulated physical responses. Shield hats deflected dark spells. In another life, Fred and George might have been leading magical researchers or inventors, but their choice to reject formal education in favor of self-made success paints a narrative that is far more complex and far more dangerous than it appears. What many forget is the context surrounding their departure. The school was under siege not in a literal sense, but from within. Umbridge had transformed Hogwarts into a military camp disguised as a school. Under her regime, learning had ceased to be dynamic. It had become a stifling memorization of ministry-approved knowledge, devoid of practice and questioning. In such a poisoned environment, their exit felt like salvation, even revolution. They did not flee learning, they fled the perversion of it. But this nuance often escapes notice, especially to young readers or viewers who see only the triumphant escape, the blazing glory, and the promise of a life lived on one's own terms. Fred and George were not ordinary teenagers. They were not even ordinary wizards. From their earliest years at Hogwarts, they had shown a rare aptitude for invention. They created products that defied expectations and pushed boundaries. Even Hermione, ever the voice of caution and reason, admitted in Order of the Phoenix that those two shouldn't be here, they should be in a research facility. Their brilliance lay not only in their humor, but in their understanding of magical properties, reactions, and consumer desires. They read people as well as they read potions books. But therein lies the catch. They were self-driven geniuses. To emulate their path without sharing their talents would be to court disaster. And yet, the message left behind in their smoke trail was potent. Their departure suggested that learning was shackles, and true brilliance lay in throwing those shackles off. It whispered, if they can do it, maybe I can too. But most cannot. Most are not prodigies of magical engineering with a knack for sales and an eye for market trends. Most are like Colin Creevey, filled with wonder but in need of guidance. Or like Neville Longbottom, whose potential took years to surface and required nurturing, not abandonment. The world is not filled with Freds and George, it is filled with students trying to find their way. Consider Lee Jordan, their closest friend and frequent co-conspirator. He shared their values and their disdain for Umbridge, but he stayed. He remained at Hogwarts, fought within the system, and used his voice through the radio station Potterwatch later on. His rebellion was quiet, sustained, and deeply meaningful. He did not become the face of fireworks and flight, but his resistance was just as critical. Lee's path was less glamorous, but it was rooted in resilience and persistence. Fred and George's path was lightning. Lee's was thunder, distant but enduring. Even Ginny Weasley, their own sister, chose to finish school. Ginny was daring, skilled and independent, but she never considered education beneath her. She recognized the value of learning not just spells, but discipline, cooperation and defense. When she later joined the Holyhead Harpies and then became a journalist, she brought with her the grounding Hogwarts had provided. Her success story did not require abandoning school. It required using it as a launch pad. Unlike her brothers, she made education work for her. Then there is the question of impact. How many students at Hogwarts, watching the twins soar away, wondered if they should give up too? What silent seeds were planted that day? Did any Muggle-borns or half-bloods from poorer families consider dropping out, thinking success was just a joke away? In reality, magical society, like the non-magical one, is deeply stratified. Fred and George had the support of their family, connections at Hogwarts, and enough charisma to convince anyone of anything. Not everyone is afforded such a cushion. Their rebellion, while bold, was built on a foundation they themselves may not have fully seen. We must also remember the war. After the twins left, Hogwarts became even more hostile. Knowledge became a weapon. Survival required it. The DA, Dumbledore's army, was born not out of mischief, but necessity. Harry, Hermione, Neville, and Luna did not abandon education. They reinvented it. They met in secret, taught each other, passed on spells, and created a sanctuary of learning in the heart of a regime. Their examples stood in contrast to the twins' exit. They stayed, endured, and empowered others through knowledge. It was not flashy, but it saved lives. George's later life after Fred's death casts the entire story in a somber hue. The vibrant, mischievous duo was halved by war. Their business survived, but George did not truly recover. In the Deathly Hallows, the war rips through families, dreams and futures. George is left with a gaping absence, running the shop alone. He marries, he raises a family, but the spark is dulled. The cost of rebellion, of war, of refusing to play by the rules, is paid in the coin of grief. If Fred's death had happened while he was still a student, still protected, would things have been different? It's a question that haunts. And what of Percy Weasley, the black sheep turned bureaucrat? Percy was mocked for his love of rules, his ambition, his obsession with status. Yet in the end he returned to fight alongside his family. He made mistakes, but he also survived and brought order where chaos once reigned. The juxtaposition is sharp. Fred and George, who rejected the system entirely, versus Percy, who clung to it too tightly. Somewhere in the middle lies the real lesson, not to rebel blindly and not to conform absolutely. It is also worth noting that Fred and George did not entirely reject learning. They simply chose a different form. Their shop was a laboratory. Their experiments were meticulous, often dangerous, and always creative. But young readers may not see the late nights, the failed tests, the injuries, the setbacks. They see the storefront, the galleons, the glory. Education, in their world, still happened. It just wasn't called that. Yet it's misleading to suggest their path required no study, no discipline, no rigor. It did. It simply wasn't structured in the traditional sense. Even Ron Weasley, often dismissed as the most average of the group, finished his education before becoming an Auror. He did not possess the dazzling intellect of Hermione or the fearless leadership of Harry, but he grew through structure, battles, and brotherhood. He was shaped by staying. His loyalty, humor, and courage were honed, not inherited. He did not abandon school because he understood, perhaps instinctively, that he needed it. He lacked the wings to fly without it. In the grand narrative of Hogwarts, rebellion is a thread that runs deep. From the founders to the marauders, from Dumbledore to the DA, rule-breaking often signals growth. But not all rebellion is the same. Some is forged in thought, in purpose, in strategy. Some, like the Weasley twins, is performance and philosophy intermingled. But the danger lies in imitation without insight. Not all rebellion is fruitful. Some is just noise. There's a fine line between inspiration and misinterpretation. Fred and George inspired a generation to believe in possibility. But possibility without preparation can lead to ruin. Their departure was dazzling, yes, but it also left a vacuum. Teachers, mentors, even parents are rarely equipped to counter that kind of myth-making. What do you say to a child who wants to quit school because the Weasley twins did? How do you explain the exception versus the rule? The magical world needs inventors, yes. It needs risk-takers and visionaries, but it also needs historians, healers, auras, linguists, farmers, and curse-breakers. These roles require study, patience, and discipline. They do not make headlines, they do not ride brooms through the ceiling, but they hold the world together. Hogwarts, for all its flaws, is still the forge in which many of those roles are shaped. Even Dumbledore, the ultimate champion of free thought, never encouraged students to abandon learning. He allowed the twins to leave, not out of agreement, but because he believed in choice. Yet choice without wisdom is not freedom, it's recklessness. In The Half-Blood Prince, he says to Harry, "It is our choices and that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." But choices require awareness of consequences. Fred and George understood theirs, others might not. The irony is that Fred and George, in fleeing the classroom, became some of the greatest teachers Hogwarts never had. They taught courage, ingenuity, and audacity. But they also taught shortcuts, and shortcuts in magic are perilous. Just ask Tom Riddle. The twins never strayed into darkness, but they danced on the edge of chaos. Their legacy is laughter and loss, brilliance and burned bridges, and perhaps that is the most human truth in their story. They were not villains nor saints. They were young men trying to carve joy into a darkening world. But when their fireworks faded, what remained was a silence filled with questions. Was it worth it? Should they have stayed? Or did they shine so brightly because they knew, somewhere deep down, that light is always fleeting? Number 26. Lack of self-reflection. Fred and George Weasley are remembered with fondness and admiration by many readers of the Harry Potter series. Their charm, their wit, their unwavering bond as brothers, and their defiance against authority earned them a place in fans' hearts. Yet as one reads more closely, a peculiar absence begins to surface, an absence of introspection. For all their brilliance in crafting jokes and causing chaos, Fred and George rarely, if ever, engage in self-reflection. They act, they laugh, they rebel, but they do not examine. Their energy is outward-facing, their mischief designed to provoke, not to contemplate. This lack of self-awareness casts a subtle shadow over their otherwise vivid presence, suggesting a startling emotional limitation in thought. Characters often praised for their complexity. Take, for instance, the scene in Order of the Phoenix, when the twins release a swarm of enchanted fireworks through the corridors of Hogwarts. It is a moment of triumph, rebellion, and pure theatrical chaos. Students cheer as the inquisitorial squad stumbles in confusion, and Umbridge is rendered powerless. Yet, amid the spectacle, there is collateral damage, the frightened first years, the professors who must clean up the mess, the general atmosphere of disruption in an already unstable school. Fred and George do not pause to consider these effects. They do not question whether their actions, though symbolically powerful, might have unintended consequences. Instead, they revel in the praise and disappear into legend. "Give her hell from us." "Peeves," they call out, leaving a school on the brink of collapse behind them. Even earlier in the series, during Goblet of Fire, the twins attempt to trick the goblet into believing they are of age by using an aging potion. Their plan, of course, fails spectacularly. They are thrown back by a magical barrier and left with long, white beards for their trouble. Everyone laughs and the moment passes quickly. But what lingers is their lack of reflection. They do not wonder aloud whether perhaps they were taking the Triwizard Tournament too lightly or whether the rules might exist for good reason. There is no acknowledgement of the fact that the tournament had nearly killed participants in the past. Their actions are explained away as a bit of fun and the danger they might have walked into is never mentioned again. One of the more painful examples of this absence of self-reflection appears in Philosopher's Stone, when they enchant snowballs to repeatedly hit the back of Professor Quirrell's turban. It's a moment played for laughs, harmless mischief perhaps. But knowing what the turban conceals, the act takes on a far more sinister meaning. They were unknowingly pelting Voldemort himself. The narrative does not indicate that Fred or George ever thought back on this moment with any gravity. They never reflect on how close they came to mortal danger, or how easily their fun could have cost lives. The joke is left hanging in the air, unexplored, unprocessed. In Chamber of Secrets, when Ron receives a howler from his mother after crashing the flying car into the Whomping Willow, Fred and George burst into laughter. Their reaction is instinctive, mocking, and devoid of sympathy. Ron is humiliated, but they treat the scene as entertainment. "We tried to stop him, Mum," they echo sarcastically, without acknowledging the genuine danger Ron and Harry had been in. The car could have malfunctioned mid-air. The tree could have crushed them. They had risked expulsion and their lives, but to Fred and George it's just another day, another punchline. Even their pranks on Percy Weasley reveal this tendency. Percy, the rule-abiding older brother, is an easy target for their mischief. Fred and George put beetles in his bed, hide his prefect badge, and sabotage his attempts at dignity. Percy, admittedly pompous, becomes the scapegoat for their jokes. But when Percy eventually cuts ties with the family during Order of the Phoenix, the twins never once suggest they might have contributed to that fracture. They never ask if years of mockery might have pushed Percy further into isolation, never show any remorse for treating him as a figure of ridicule. Their disdain for his choices blinds them to the complexity of his situation. Their treatment of Ron, their younger brother, is equally troubling at times. In Prisoner of Azkaban, they gift him a joke wand that turns into rubber, and they often belittle him for his fears and insecurities. When Ron expresses anxiety over Scabbers' health, Fred and George tease him mercilessly. This pattern continues through the books. Ron becomes the butt of their jokes more often than not. And though Ron clearly seeks their approval, the twins rarely offer it. They don't pause to consider the emotional toll their mockery might take. There is no heartfelt moment of recognition, no apology, no evolution in their behavior. Even the creation of their joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, reflects a deep lack of reflection. They proudly test their products on fellow students, some of which cause nosebleeds, vomiting, or temporary unconsciousness. In Order of the Phoenix, they feed an experimental candy to an unsuspecting student who promptly collapses. Though they offer a remedy, they do not ask for consent, nor do they show concern for long-term effects. Their explanation is that it's all in the name of innovation. But innovation without ethics is a dangerous game, and Fred and George never seem to grasp that line. What makes this absence of self-reflection more striking is the contrast with other characters. Harry, for all his impulsiveness, often dwells on his actions. After the Department of Mysteries battle in Order of the Phoenix, he is consumed with guilt over Sirius's death. Hermione, ever the thinker, constantly evaluates the morality of their choices, even when it makes her unpopular. Even Ron, who jokes and complains, occasionally reveals deep insecurities and questions his worth. Fred and George, by contrast, remain emotionally static. Their humour shields them from introspection. This lack of emotional depth reaches a painful climax during the Battle of Hogwarts. Fred dies, suddenly, shockingly, and without closure. His final moments are spent laughing at a joke Percy made. It's a poetic, yet tragic end. And yet one cannot help but wonder, had Fred survived, would he have changed? Would the war have forced him to reflect on the impact of his actions, the fragility of life, the weight of choices? Or would he have returned to jokes and jests, burying the pain beneath laughter? The series leaves this question unanswered, and George, in his grief, becomes a living monument to a life unexamined. George's mourning, though, offers a sliver of change. After Fred's death, George becomes quieter, more reserved. We are told he can never quite laugh the same way again. There's tragedy in that silence, a sense that only loss could pierce the armor of his carefree persona. But even this grief is not explored deeply. We do not see George analyze who Fred was or what they had meant to others. There is no diary, no letter, no monologue of regret. Just silence, aching and incomplete. In Half-Blood Prince, when Dumbledore dies and the school mourns, Fred and George are largely absent from the emotional scenes. There is no record of their thoughts, no shared memory or reflection on a man who had stood by their family. Their shop thrives, even as the world collapses around them. Their loyalty is not in question, they fight bravely when it matters, but their emotional engagement remains on the surface. What's most frustrating is how easily this could have been remedied. A single moment of quiet reflection, a single line of regret or doubt would have added layers to their character. If Fred or George had once said, "Maybe we went too far," it would have changed everything, but they do not. Their charisma and popularity allow them to escape scrutiny, to remain unchallenged in a way no other characters are. They are the eternal jesters, never expected to evolve. It is not that humor and self-reflection are incompatible. On the contrary, the best comedians are often deeply introspective, but Fred and George are not written this way. Their jokes are weapons, not windows. They use laughter to deflect, to dominate, to silence dissent. They rarely laugh at themselves, never examine the roots of their behavior. They are architects of chaos, uninterested in blueprints for understanding. Even in moments of real danger, such as during their escape from Hogwarts in Order of the Phoenix, their parting gesture is a firework display. It is brilliant, brave, unforgettable, and utterly devoid of introspection. They do not look back. They do not hesitate. Their parting words are clever but never thoughtful. "Time to cause some mayhem," they declare, as if the world is a stage and they its prankster gods. Their lack of self-reflection matters because it limits the emotional resonance of their characters. While others grow, learn, and struggle with their flaws, Fred and George remain static. They are bright lights that never flicker, never question their glow. It makes them enjoyable, but not transformative. They entertain, but they do not invite identification. Readers may love them, but they do not see themselves in them. There is a cost to this emotional flatness. In a series that so often explores trauma, healing, and redemption, Fred and George stand apart. They experience loss, but they do not grow from it. They cause pain, but they do not acknowledge it. Their story is one of missed opportunities, moments when self-reflection could have added weight, nuance, and power to their narrative, but those moments pass unseized. In the end, Fred and George remain symbols of rebellion, humor, and daring. But symbols do not feel, they do not change. They shine brightly, then vanish. Fred dies with a smile on his face and George is left with half a heart. But the silence they leave behind is not only the silence of death, it is the silence of things never said, questions never asked, regrets never voiced. In that silence, their legacy is both brilliant and hollow.